So I'm introducing our first speaker today, Dr. Zach Bush, MD. Dr. Zach Bush is one of the few triple board certified physicians in the country with expertise in internal medicine, endocrinology and metabolism, and hospice and palliative care. The breakthrough science that Dr. Bush and his colleagues have delivered offers profound new insights into human health and longevity. His educational efforts provide a foundation for grassroots movement to transform our business and legislative environments, and ultimately shift consumer behavior to bring about radical change in the mega industries of big agriculture, big pharma, and Western medicine at large. His morning presentation today is titled, "The Soil Microbiome, Ground Zero of Our Modern Disease Epidemics." Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Zach Bush, MD.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Great. All right. Thank you all for having me. What a full room. Wonderful to see so many spirits here. A beautiful, soulful community here. And what a gorgeous setting you guys live in. It's amazing. I'm going to try to jump between our presentations here. Oh, there's Zen Honeycutt. Is Zen here today? I don't like Zen. She's a close colleague and friend. Well, so many of you have already come up and said some amazing, beautiful things about who you are and how you're impacting the world. And really wonderful when the morning starts with a bunch of hugs and everybody's in tears by the end of the hug. And that's a good sign that we're meeting each other in a point of vulnerability and a point of sincerity and a point of real passionate truth. Truth is one of those amazing things that I think as a scientist and as a physician, you think you're being trained into when you start on this journey. And your defense of the truth that you're taught. I hear feedback, is this annoying to you guys? You're not hearing a buzz? All right. If you can drop that sound just a little bit, that already sounds better. All right. All right. So the thought here is around the pursuit of truth and what it means to us as human beings to be interacting with it, and why we have such stress when we're being told untruth. And you guys are right on this button right now here in this state, is really dealing with a legislative, bureaucratic government structure that's trying to force a half-truth on you and on your children. And it comes in many forms, right? Our government structures, which are us, by the way. It's not like some bizarre, deity out there that's, forcing us. We created this structure. We as consumers created this structure of government. And if it's dysfunctional, it's largely because I think we outsourced it, right? We outsourced the responsibility of self-governance, and we started to give up rights out of really fear, right? I think, in my lifetime at least, I've seen no bigger collapse of civil liberties than 9/11. And so we have a fear event that plays out, and suddenly as a population, we're willing to release a whole bunch of civil liberties. We're literally, out of just this one fear moment, said, oh my gosh, take care of us, please. Whatever you need to do, just take care of us. And so it's an interesting history for our country, and even more bizarre when you're part of a Bush family, and that you look back through the last 200 years of my family, and you find out that at each point of major social change in this country, a Bush family was bizarrely involved. And so it turns out that Sarah Bush was Abraham Lincoln's grandmother. And so you see one family kind of being, whether it's for better or worse, one family kind of caught up in this. And this is not a grandiose talk on why Bushes are important. It's instead a talk about how truth can be subverted, or truth can be owned, if you will, by a very small number of hands. And my personal goal is to be the positive force to all the negative force that my family has perhaps played out over history, not because my family is unique. Every family has participated in good and bad aspects of our social change and reform and everything else. And the exciting thing to me as I mature is to realize I don't have to fight against anything. There's been so much bad stuff done in history, and for every bad, there's a good. For every darkness, there is light. For every yin, there's a yang. And so I want you to think about that, because activism can become its own problem. We're going to talk about immunity today, and what we see again and again in medicine today is the immune system becomes its own problem. And so whether we're talking about the gut, or we're talking about vaccines, or we're talking about any aspect of human immunity as we understand it, ground zero is its own problem. And so I want to caution us today as we start into all these topics today that you don't walk away more fired up and sense of fight and more sense of, you know what, we can just become channels for the light that would be the answer to, or the physics response to the darkness. And as I start to practice my life like this, and as I start to run my companies like this, everything is getting easier because I'm not doing anything. The universe is doing something. The universe is balancing things out, and we simply need to make ourselves a conduit for that light. And so I hope that's just an entry point for us today, so that we don't walk away feeling more militant, so we don't walk away feeling like we have to fight harder, so that we don't have to walk away feeling guilty for our children's health or somehow responsible for our children's health, and instead realizing the universe is pouring into these children all of the potential opposite of the ag system that we've created, the chemical pharmaceutical system that we've created, any of these things. And so I want to completely leave fear behind before we start this day. Because if we act out of a space with no fear, we're going to see truth very clearly. And if we accept truth without emotional programming around it, we'll use that truth effectively. Your emotions threaten truth all the time. And that's hard to believe because many of your emotions feel righteous and they feel like they're coming from a good place of response to a bad thing. But over and over again in my clinical practice, I find that a cancer never happens until you have enough emotional programming underneath the surface to disrupt the truth that's within every cell. And the truth is life itself. Life just is true. Life happens. There's no way to prevent life. It is constant. And nowhere is this more obvious than in my hospice work. I have never seen a death that looked like an endpoint. It's never happened. As you sit by a bedside in a patient's home, or you sit in an ICU and watch a patient slip from their body, there is such a release, there is such an expansion, there is such a rebirth in that moment. And so if we cannot fear death itself, and if death is nowhere near an endpoint, then as a species, as we approach this extraordinary pinnacle of history, which we're upon right now, which is our own extinction, which is a physical death, a physical disappearance, we will expand no matter what into a new awareness, into our spiritual truth, into our full identity in that death. And if we die over the next 60 to 70 years, which we're on trajectory to do right now, we should look at that non-empathically. We're just another species. We've wiped out 40% of biology on Earth in the last 50 years. And so all these species, right now we're losing one species every 20 minutes. And so by the end of today, we will have lost another dozen or two species to extinction, gone, on planet Earth, which is this tiny little blue dot in the middle of black space. And these are species going extinct, done. No longer to ever breathe on this planet. And we're one of those species, and we're charging towards our death moment. I'm totally fine with that, as long as we're alert enough, as long as we are not so doped up in our death throes that we can't be aware of the journey. And that's what concerns me about medicine. It concerns me that in our hospice work, we have most of our patients very doped up, narcotics and everything else, and they're unaware of the rebirth that they're going through. At least not on that physical plane. Obviously, spiritually, they're in it. But unfortunately, their children and grandchildren don't get to see their journey of expansion. And so we fear death. And so we fear our children getting vaccines, or we fear our children getting a disease or a neurologic injury, or we fear all kinds of things because we haven't really grasped that we are actually light beings, that we are actually beings that have been here forever. From the beginning, our souls have been. I believe that. I think all of our souls are just fractals of whatever it is we call God or universe. It is a one physical force that would manifest itself into billions of souls. And it gives me a great sense of excitement that we stand here in human history with 7 billion other souls. 7 billion is an enormous number. And I travel so much now that I'm always struck by what 7 billion looks like. I can't see them all at once, but I'm always amazed. I've never been in this town before. And yet I drive these roads, and there's all these cars with all these people, with all these kids, with all of this community, with all this stuff that I've never met before or seen before. And yet it's here. And so there are 7 billion souls living out lives all around us with complexities and all the journeys that we're living as well. And we're a fractal of that. We're a tiny piece of that fabric. This is broad brush strokes. We haven't even touched on the gut yet, and you're starting to wonder if this talk is ever going to get started. But I hope it sets the tone for the day. I hope that we can set the tone of, let's step into our light today together. Let's not try to fight today. Let's set down the fight. Let's set down the fear for our children and realize for every action there's an opposite and equal reaction. And we don't have to create it. That's just physics. That's just simple scientific math. And so let's be a conduit for the light today. And so let's go ahead and close our eyes just for a moment, and we're going to do mindfulness moment here together. Close your eyes for a moment. And we're just going to do 30 seconds of silence to make sure you just scan your body from scalp all the way to your toes to let go of fear and reactivity. And you're holding on to it, so just let it go. Thank you for that. From this space, truth just can't help but fill. When we let go of fear, it immediately makes room for more truth. These are numbers you guys have all heard from me if you've heard any of my talks. We'll try to frame this again today, hopefully differently in your mind through different things, because the first reaction to this is obviously fear. And I see opportunity instead of fear. Autism now, I hit 1 in 36 children affected by autism in our country. That number just revised again about 6 months ago or something like that. And those are old numbers. Those are based on the numbers from 2016, so we're always a couple years behind on our public health statistics. But that number has been doubling every 6 years or so. And we're on course to do that again. And so the rate of doubling has hit that just in the recent decade here. And so this is 1975 with 1 in 5,000 children affected by autism in our country. This is 2012 with 1 in 88 affected. And the interesting thing about this trajectory is by the time we hit 2001, we were pretty sure we had a problem. But there was a lot of us in the science community that were saying, well, maybe we're just recognizing this autism thing better, and therefore it's not actually an epidemic of this neurologic injury in our children. It's just that we're starting to recognize this better. And I would say anybody who would pose that argument has simply never seen an autistic child, certainly not in their clinic. We didn't miss in 1975 that 1 in 30 kids were suddenly losing verbal and cognitive skills around 18 months of age, and it would take years, if not a lifetime, to recover those simple capacities for sensory processing. We simply were not that stupid in 1975. And so there's no way this was actually a diagnostic dilemma in this trajectory. which is really wonderful because this, I think, really is the canary in the coal mine scientifically, where we have almost every other disease doing the same pattern. Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia, cardiovascular phenomenon like atrial fibrillation, things like that, your autoimmune diseases, cancer itself, all on a similar trajectory. And with cancer, you can certainly make the argument, well, we didn't have MRIs and CTs and all this fancy diagnostic equipment in 1975, and so certainly we're just seeing more cancer because we can see it, not necessarily because there's more of it. So the diagnostic kind of dilemma has been out there as a denial tool in almost every condition. And I love autism, and I love working with autism because there's no diagnostic dilemma here. I have 2 children. They made it from birth to 21 years old, and I know that journey is very predictable. There's a timeline to the maturation of a human brain, and there's a timeline to us actually losing our human brain. And so as we look down this list, obviously we see a lot of the normal aging phenomena on that list. And so we have an epidemic of aging in the end, right? Because none of these conditions on this list were undescribed in the 1970s. Interestingly, some of these were undescribed if you go back to the 1800s. And so I think we really do have a new condition of Alzheimer's, true Alzheimer's. Dementia's been around since the beginning of time, but true Alzheimer's, I think, is a relatively new phenomenon. And I think that something like the autism injury is very, very poignant to our current century. But nonetheless, I would say that none of these are brand new conditions, but we have seen them accelerate. And so to see now major depression, for example, in our adult population at 1 in 2 prevalence is stunning, because Sigmund Freud and his colleagues were the beginning of evidence-based medicine, and I think most doctors forget that psychiatry actually led the charge into evidence-based medicine and population statistics and all of that, coming out of France, and then the US and France really working extensively over the late 1800s and early portions of the 1900s. And we had really defined very accurately the penetrance of mental disease in that era. And it was clear that major depression was at about 1 in 100 at that time. And so to go from 1 in 100 to 1 in 2 in a short century, and really the 1 in 100 really held true all the way through the 1940s. And so it was really only the last 50, 60 years that we saw this explosion of major depression. Cancer, interestingly, is now threatening to surpass cardiovascular disease as the #1 cause of death in America. 1 in 2 males diagnosed with cancer, and depending on what study, 1 in 3 or 1 in 2 women with cancer. And then this dementia statistic at the bottom, you don't see the ratio of 1 to 1 very often in a public health statistic. That means 100%. 100% of us have dementia. That's kind of weird. Well, this is a study that came out of the University of Virginia, and what they were doing is they were looking across the entire population from like age 12 to 95, trying to figure out at what point do we all show neurocognitive changes for memory loss and memory storage. And unfortunately, the number that, and this is old data, this study was published around 2003-04, and so what they found was that by age 28, all of the subjects were showing signs of dementia. Fortunately, most of you look younger than 28, but you're speeding towards this threshold for loss of memory. And so 28 is an interesting thought process, right? It's like, wow, we've got kind of this formative years that we know that the human brain starts to kind of get a lot more concrete and less plastic by the late teens, early 20s, when we finally start to get some real creative opportunity in our education system. Up until then, it's formulaic over and over again. And so I don't think I really had an opportunity to start to learn and really explore my own thoughts until I was actually in my postdoctoral work when I was in my 30s. And so it's interesting that our education system waits so long to give us, because by the time I got there, I had early dementia and a total loss of plasticity of my brain. And so whatever creative thoughts I've had since then have been blunted by the reality of this aging process. So we're literally seeing this acceleration of aging. And we had to kind of give up by 2015. Even the naysayers had to give up on the theory that we were just recognizing autism better, because we doubled our rates between 2012 and 2015. And so we've gone on this vertical climb of the autism, and we're now coming to terms with the fact that we are doing something that's so prevalent in our children's generations that it's changing the way that their brain is able to function and develop. And so that course, like I said, has been followed by the cancer paths and everything else. This is a scary scary line here. The orange is the males, the gray is the females, and unfortunately this is just 1990 to 2015. And so we more than doubled our rates of cancer in males in one generation. 25 years is considered a scientific definition for a generation. And so in one generation, we doubled our rates of cancer, which should be completely impossible. If you read the American Cancer Institute's definition of cancer, it's the most common genetic disease. That's how they define it. Is it possible that a genetic disease in one generation could double its rates? No, that's completely scientifically impossible. And yet, all of our money that we're pouring in through the NIH into cancer research, I'm a former cancer researcher, chemotherapy developer as of 10 years ago, and so I've been on quite a journey of deconstruction. But the reality is that line completely undermines my teaching or what I was told cancer was. And so that's impossible. What gets me concerned is the tightening of that curve. You start to see that tightening up. It's starting to go into its hockey stick move there. You see that tightening up and hockey stick, what that turns into. It turns into a logarithmic number there. So this is now in its vertical climb of a logarithmic parabolic curve of epidemic. This is what Ebola would do until it wipes out some 80% of its victims, and then the curve flattens out and then goes away. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about infection or any other disease process. These vertical curves that happen are terrifying because it means that you're going to have a pairing of the population. And so as we see that curve tightening up, we can be pretty confident that by 2035, we're going to be seeing some 80% of adults with cancer. At the same time, we'll see 1 in 3 children with autism. 1 in 3 children with autism, 80% of the adults with cancer. Those two conditions alone, let's ignore everything else on the list, those two conditions alone will cripple our nation. We do not have a healthcare or a fiscal depth that would allow us to support that level of chronic disease. And so we stand here in our hospice moment. As a nation, we are diagnosed with our fatal condition. Our fatal condition is a loss of productivity. That's it. Like, forget about the diseases. We can't produce anything when 1 in 3 children have autism and 80% of our adults are dealing with cancer. And so we're at that moment of complete loss of productivity. And I look across this room and you all look freaking healthy. And in some ways, that's our problem. Is since we look at ourselves as individuals and we can create these micro environments around an individual and see we're healthy, we're healthy, we're healthy, we start to lose track of the fact that as a species, we're speeding towards this brick wall. So it's easy to kind of be deluded by our own moment of health to think that our species is going to survive. Our species cannot survive as the ecology collapses, obviously, and that's exactly what's underpinning all of this, I would say. What I mean by that is really this concept of an organic garden. What's the end point for this talk? I should know that. What time does this talk end? Is it 9:50?
You can go to 11:10.
Are you serious?
We're extending it.
So you can't eat lunch, but I'm going to keep talking. So good news, more information. Bad news, you're now in your intermittent fast. And so that's all right. We'll talk about intermittent fasting maybe sometime in the day and how that makes you younger. And so what's happening here is a phenomenon of the science starting to come to grips with the fact that all of that disease and all of those conditions and everything else are symptoms of the collapse of an organic garden. And your organic garden turns out to be your entire body. And so many of you came in expecting to hear about the gut and all of that, and we're going to talk about some of that stuff. But the amazing thing that we've now had to come to terms with in the microbial world, in this world of the microbiome science over the last 5 years, is to find out that every tissue in your body should be an organic garden thriving with bacteria, fungi, viruses, and everything else. That's very hard for a doctor to wrap their head around, because we were taught that if there were to be bacteria in your breast, that would be called cellulitis or an abscess, and that would kill you. We need to give you antibiotics and kill that. Well, this study was really kind of the best one done to date, but it was done in 2014. And it was done because there was a lot of data coming out that we kept finding all of this DNA of bacteria in breast tissue when we would do DNA analysis for tumor injury. And so, again, we believe even to this day in Western medicine that cancer is a genetic disease. And even in my lab, we can take tumor tissue out of my patients and I can immortalize that tissue and we can run it genomics. And the average cancer cell has 20,000 unrepaired injuries at the genetic level. 20,000 injuries in the genome is actually pretty crazy, because you'll find out about the genome this afternoon, but we actually don't have that many genes as humans. So to see 20,000 unrepaired injuries is kind of phenomenal. But in these genomic studies, while we're trying to figure out what is the genetics of cancer, we kept finding bacterial DNA. And it didn't seem to matter what tissue. And so this study really set out to say, is this real? Are we really seeing a population of bacteria in the human breast, for example? And so they set out to not only find bacteria, but to speciate the bacteria there. And what they found is in all the breast tissue that was diseased and had breast cancer, Methylobacterium radiotolerans was the dominant species of bacteria in that tissue. And so the idea started to become, I wonder if Methylobacterium is causing cancer. Maybe it's an infectious disease in the end, and it's not a genetic disease. So to figure that out, they actually biopsied the other breast of the same women that didn't have cancer in it, and they found out that Sphingomonas was the dominant species. To find out that healthy breasts with no cancer have a dominant bacterial genome was fascinating. And so then the realization was like, wow, Sphingomonas is actually an aerobic obligate. It needs oxygen to thrive. As a breast becomes damaged and acidic from what? Emotional damage, emotional underpinnings is the driver of cancer in any tissue, because you have to have disruption of normal oxygen exchange at the cellular level, deeper than the cell itself. Down at the molecular level, you need disruption of oxygen exchange down in the mitochondria and the rest. And so Sphingomonas disappears when you don't have enough oxygen. And so Methylobacterium, it turns out, is really good at dealing with environments that are lacking oxygen. And so you kill the oxygen, or you deprive the environment of oxygen, Sphingomonas has to move out, and Methylobacterium moves in. It's not an infection, it's an opportunity for a different species to try to do damage control. And I'm convinced now it's not causing any harm. It is, in fact, trying to do damage control, because it turns out in the same study, they had determined as investigators they were pretty sure Methylobacterium was involved in the cancer process at this point. So they said, what we're going to do is we're going to prove that Methylobacterium increases in the cancers that are killing the women. And so the more Methylobacterium, the more aggressive the cancer, and the woman dies from that tumor because it's got this toxic bacterial environment. So they did the DNA load correlation with the advancement of disease, and of course found the exact opposite. The more sterile the tumor got, the quicker she died from cancer. An extraordinary demonstration that the human breast is an organic garden. And perturbation of that garden leads to collapse of biology. Collapse of biology will lead to disease or disease. And that's the beauty that I now see in every one of my patients, is if I can see them more and more as an organic garden and figure out what's disrupting that, then I can actually maybe be the healer that I wish I would be. If I'm right, and if the science is right, that bacteria are critical to the survival and combating cancer death, we should see a huge correlation between antibiotic use and cancer death. And so I took maps. This one is from a New England Journal of Medicine article in 2013 showing the rates of antibiotic prescription per state. And the darker the state, the more frequent the antibiotic exposure. And so the interesting numbers here is this is prescriptions per 1,000 persons. 996 to 1,237 prescriptions per 1,000 persons. Can you handle that number? That means that 100% or at least 20% of the population getting at least 2 courses of antibiotics in a year. So per year, this is, and now look at the darkest states and cancer death. And you see a state-by-state perfect correlation. Whoa. When was the last time you had a urinary tract infection, walked in to get your 3-day course of antibiotics, and the doc said, here you go, no problem. By the way, you're probably going to die of cancer if you take this. No. We don't know what we're doing with antibiotics. And next to painkillers, they're the most frequent thing we dish out as doctors. And we dish them out like candy, right? 3 days of Cipro, 3 days of this, 3 days of that. we're destroying the organic garden that would cause life to happen. Amazingly, I don't think I have this slide here in this set here because this one was not supposed to talk about the brain, but I can't help talking about cool stuff, and you guys just extended my talk time, so it's so awesome. People will say, you can now talk for 3 times as long, and I still run out of time. And it's like, it's so frustrating on some levels, but I just trust that all my electrons are being shared with you. You have all of my knowledge by the end of this. And so, fascinating, if we overlay the major depression pattern for the country, it's identical. And so, as we give antibiotics, our major depression goes up in the same path there. And we now know that 1 course of antibiotics in a year will increase your risk of major depression by 17% in the next 12 months. 1 course of antibiotics will increase your risk of an anxiety disorder by 24%. If you have 2 courses of antibiotics in a year, your risk of depression suddenly goes up by 44%. Your risk of anxiety even more. And so in other words, as you receive that antibiotic prescription, your doc is going to say, just to warn you, I'm going to annihilate your ability to make neurotransmitters and have a functional sense of day and purpose, and I just increased your 20-year risk of cancer by a very significant degree. Would you like a different course of action? Would you like an alternative to the 3 days of Cipro? And of course the answer is that's exactly what you should do, is find an alternative to the antibiotic for what it is, because ultimately you're treating an organic garden that's just out of balance. And don't we do the same thing in our farming industry? We annihilate the soil, we screw up its nutrient density, and so the response is weeds. Weeds are very, very good at fixing soil. And they show up on purpose, per species, on purpose to fix the situation. And we then walk around with a carcinogen called Roundup and we spray those weeds. And be like, those are noxious, annoying things. Well, that's exactly what's happening, is when the weeds crop up in your body, the doctors are going in with Roundup and saying, I'm just going to annihilate that thing because that must be the problem. I now spend most of my time lecturing to doctors around this topic of there is no such thing as Lyme disease. There is no such thing as Ebola. There is no such thing as HIV. There is no such thing as infection itself. There's only weeds that crop up according to its environment. And if we stop considering the opportunity to change the terrain, we're going to keep having more and more aggressive weeds because we more and more desperately need change in that terrain. And if you look at the HIV epidemic and where it started, it follows the course of our antibiotic exposures very carefully throughout Africa. And so we started the spraying, the widespread spraying of the toxins that we now use in the American food chain in South Africa in the late 70s. And within a few years, we see HIV develop and the AIDS epidemic of the 80s. Now, did that chemical cause AIDS? No. It caused a collapse of the ecosystem that then favored a retrovirus. By the way, there's millions and millions of retrovirus species that are in your body right now that are not harming you in the least. In fact, are helping your biology actually function. And so when we look this afternoon at genomics and the microbiome, you're going to find out that we should fear nothing in the microbiome. It's literally impossible that the microbiome is against us. And so we need to look at ourselves as this organic garden, and anything we would do to combat that organic garden, we would run into serious problems for. And so what about probiotics? Such a huge industry now. We're somewhere around $30 billion a year just in the US on probiotic industry, if you include like our yogurts and all this stuff that we make with probiotics. And so this study got published. I've been railing against probiotics for about almost a decade now because they don't make any sense scientifically. Your gut should have somewhere around 30 to 40,000 species of bacteria. You should have somewhere around an interaction of 5 million species of fungi. You're probably up around 300,000 species of parasites. You've got somewhere around probably 100 million or more species of viruses. And that microbiome, then we say, you know what, we're going to micromanage that. We're going to improve that by adding 2 species of bacteria. And we're going to give it to you at maybe $60 to $90 a month. Does that sound fair? We're going to give you 2 or 3 species because they're special ones because we refrigerated these ones. And so these are refrigerated bacteria. And this is not, if you make probiotics, if you sell probiotics, this isn't even teasing you at all. This is literally me in my medical practice up until the last few years thinking that I was doing something useful, thinking that I was somehow adding to the health. Once I really started to decode the human gut and we started really working on the genomics and everything else, I realized this can't be right. And so I said it wasn't right, but I didn't have any proof until, thank God, these two groups did this in Cell. So Cell is one of our most revered peer-reviewed journals out there, and in September they finally gave us the smoking gun, and this is what the data looked like. And so what they did is they took mice, gave them 2 weeks of antibiotics, and you can see the collapse of their microbiome diversity. So they went from close to 100 species down to about 15 species over the course of the 2 weeks. And so obviously they're only measuring 120 of the thousands of species in the gut, but they picked those representative species and show the collapse. Then they randomized the mice to 3 groups. One group got their own fecal transplant orally, and so they had collected stool before the antibiotic exposure, and they gave that stool back in an encapsulated form to the mice during the recovery period. And within 28 days, they were back to normal. Then they gave a placebo group that got absolutely nothing. And you can see a pretty rapid recovery of about half their species by 20 days in, something like that. That kind of plateaus, and they can't quite recover some of the more nuanced species over the course of the 40-day study, but they do have some recovery. The green line was given probiotics. Little bump at the beginning, which is interesting. I don't have time to go into the science why I think there is a bump, but the bump is then further suppressed, and then you end up just as flat as you did with 2 weeks of antibiotics. This was not what they were expecting to see. And so they then did something really cool. This was their stool. And so then the uncool part is they killed the mice. So that's never cool. But after killing the mice, they then dissected the lumen of their gut to see if in fact there was bacteria, what the bacterial species that were living in the wall of the intestine looked like. That's much different than seeing what's coming out the back end. And so there's one genomic injury that happens in the stool, but they were really looking at what happens to the diversity within the bowel wall itself. And so you can see probiotics are in the toilet here. Spontaneous recovery with nothing, they're already moving towards normal within the 40 days. But probiotics completely suppressed it, and terrifyingly, the primary 2 species they found growing in the bowel wall was the probiotic. The probiotic industry has been swearing up and down that these bacteria cannot colonize your intestines. You better hope they don't, because the bacteria we use in probiotics are actually from bovine intestines, which are ruminants, which are a much different gut flora than humans. And so we've been saying that probiotics work because they kind of add some intelligence of the microbiome in for a period of time. But don't worry, they don't actually turn your gut into a cow intestine. Unfortunately, they absolutely do, and they colonize especially a gut that's been injured. And this is very humbling, because even as of 6 months ago, right before this study was published, I said, even in my lectures and my podcasts and everything else, I was saying, if you're going to use a probiotic, the only time I can rationalize that is in the couple weeks following an antibiotic. That's the worst possible moment you could possibly take a probiotic. You do not want to add bovine species to a gut that just got clear-cut. So how does a gut recover? And the cool thing is humans are really good at this. And so this study went beyond the mouse to show us what happens in humans. Huge annihilation of the microbiome. One of my favorite things about this study is look at the species diversity of the humans in the study versus the lab rats. The lab rats had more microbiome diversity than humans in this study. It boggles my mind. Maybe we were just checking the wrong subset to really prove this out. But it startles me that humans may have a more narrow than a lab rat who never sees the light of day, has never walked on soil, has never seen anything, and yet we're worse. Like, it's really hard to wrap your mind around that we're that devoid of bacteria these days. In the human one, they followed them for 6 months. And they had better recovery in the first few weeks of the study than the mice did, but it again plateaus out, and they never recover to the statistical norm even after 6 months on a probiotic. Whereas if they had no probiotic, they actually returned to complete normal in 30 days. Let me repeat that. If the human was given 0 probiotics, they had a complete return to normal microbiome within 30 days. If they had a probiotic at 6 months, they still had no normalcy in their microbiome. Do not take a probiotic. Do not give a child a probiotic. So what the heck are we supposed to be doing for the gut? So a fascinating thing that we cannot micromanage an organic garden. If we're going to recognize the human body for what it is, we need to come to terms with what it would be to create that organic garden, which is obviously an extension far from that human gut or the human body itself, and start to see it as a connection to nature. And so we have to look beyond the antibiotic exposure to say what changed between 1970 and 2007, because this was the cancer map I just showed you with high rates of death down here in the south, but I want to show you that that has never been our cancer map in history. Previous to the year 2000, this was our cancer map. High rates of death in the northeast, and northwest, depending on what types of cancer. And suddenly, between 1997 and 2004, or 1994 and 2007, in that short period of time, we completely reversed the cancer map. That should be completely scientifically impossible. We have the most heterogeneous genomic population perhaps in the world, meaning the genetics vary in our population. And then over the course of just 15 years, which is shorter than it takes for one cancer to develop. Current understanding of how cancers happen, it takes 15 to 20 years for a cancer to develop in an individual. And suddenly, in an entire human population of diverse genomic backgrounds, we created an event where suddenly all the cancer was here, where it was the lowest cancer rates in the whole country for all of the previous recorded history. And let me tell you, New Orleans, Louisiana, and rural Alabama were just as poor in 1996 as it is today. And too often we say, well, poor people have poor access to health and therefore they're sick. As far as I can tell right now, if you have poor access to care, it's your best prognostic indicator. If you can't find a doctor, you might actually survive. And so we have this mysterious shift between 94 and 97. And I had these maps for about 6 months before I found this very cool map, because I knew it wasn't because of our antibiotics. And so even though we have this huge correlation that we're putting fuel on the fire by adding antibiotics, our antibiotic prescription rates hadn't changed over the country in that amount of time. Amazingly, this is again out of New England Journal of Medicine, looking between 2001 and 2011, over that 10-year period, there was 0 change in our antibiotic prescription rates, which I was kind of really happy about. It's like, that's great. At least maybe we're kind of waking up as doctors. And then I read the actual article to find out that the reason why that line is flat is you physically cannot get more antibiotics into a population. As a nation, we're at 833 prescriptions per 1,000 man, women, and children. 833 prescriptions for every 1,000. The reason why that line is not going up is because every year at least 17% of the population runs out of gas or is too busy to get to the doctor and can't get their antibiotic prescription. So we physically have tapped out our ability. So it can't be the antibiotic prescriptions that reverse the cancer map. We need to look for something else that killed the bacteria. And that's, of course, where we came up with this extraordinary journey into glyphosate. Glyphosate is an interesting molecule. It was actually found and developed in 1959 by a Japanese researcher who very intelligently said, that looks like bad stuff, and put it on a shelf. And then this company that he had never heard of, I'm sure, approached him in the 1974 time area and said, hey, we'd like to purchase this patent for this chemical you made. And he was like, all right. And I'm sure he gave it to him for $5,000 or something ridiculously tiny, because who needs a toxin? So sells this toxin patent to a little company called Monsanto, who was running out of marketplace for their main drug that they were selling previously, which they were selling to the US military in the form of something called Agent Orange. You've probably never heard of Monsanto or Agent Orange or any of these things, but suffice to say it was a chemical company that was involved in chemical warfare, and there was a war wrapping up in 1973 that was starting to undermine their main profit margin, so they needed to look beyond that. And it turns out that this molecule that the Japanese researcher had found was in exactly the same family of organophosphates as Agent Orange. And so they're like, we're experts in this area. We'll go buy that little patent, and this looks like a little bit less toxic version of Agent Orange. Maybe we could use this, bizarrely, as a pipe cleaner. And so they started using this and doing their initial research in its ability to clean municipal pipe systems that were getting sediment clogging. And so big factories and everything else were getting calcium deposits and mineral deposits in the large sewer systems that would then eventually clog up. So they would put this glyphosate molecule in there, and it would clean up the pipe beautifully. And it was an amazing experience because it turns out this molecule is what we call a chelator. It's great at grabbing minerals out of the environment. So they would put it through the pipe, and it would literally grab the minerals right off the wall of the pipe, and then it would pour out into the holding pond. And they found out that it was killing everything in the holding pond. And so they couldn't actually market it as a pipe cleaner in the end because it was too toxic on the back side of it to the microbiome and all the plant life around the pond. And so they said, well, if it kills plants, maybe we could create a weed killer out of it. So they didn't even go into the business of weed killing initially. It was totally an accident. And so they ended up patenting this, of course, and in 1974 they put it on the market, and they ended up putting it in a new formulation which had 16 surfactants and other things that accelerated the entrance of this molecule into biologic cells, and they patented that as Roundup, or commercialized that as Roundup. And so Roundup became a weed killer in the late 70s and accelerated in the 80s. And so as we look through history now at that cancer map and the advent of this chemical, we have an interesting phenomenon. So what is this chemical? Turns out it's actually never been patented as a weed killer. It's been patented instead as, any guesses? Antibiotic. Yep, and so antibiotic, anti-parasite, antifungal, they've patented multiple times. And they keep saying it's safer than water. That's been their tagline for a long time. This is a chemical toxin that's safer than water. Is that possible sentence to even have? But yes, that's been the tagline. Safer than water. How can they possibly claim that this thing is safer than water? Because they told us, don't worry, it hits the shikimate enzyme pathway as its active target biologically, and that's how it kills plants. Never mind that it's also a mineral chelator, and maybe minerals are important to life, but focus in on the shikimate pathway. It's an enzyme pathway that exists in bacteria, fungi, plants, and nowhere else. No eukaryotic multicellular species has the shikimate pathway. So you don't have the active target for Roundup, so how could it possibly hurt you? And so that's been the amazing short-sighted message we've gotten from all the chemical companies. Turns out that the shikimate pathway is kind of important. We don't have it, and so we depend on nature to produce these things for us. What does it make? Importantly, it makes some of the most important amino acids that are in nature. Amino acids are the building blocks for protein. Protein is the entire structure of your body. And so your body is made up of over 200,000 different types of proteins. And they constitute the enzymes that do all the detox work. They constitute the enzymes that are the antioxidants, the digestive enzymes, the pathways for nutrient integration. They're also the scaffold proteins that hold your system together, made up of all this. And interestingly, they produce a very specific group of these, which are called the aromatic amino acids. These are large amino acids that have a big carbon ring in it. And the aromatic amino acids include phenylalanine, tyrosine, and tryptophan, which are, interestingly, the entire precursors to your entire neurotransmitter environment and at least half your hormones. And so, in one fell swoop, we created a chemical that would kill function as an antibiotic in the environment, kill the soil architecture, wipe out nutrient delivery, chelate all the minerals, and eliminate some of the most critical building blocks in nature for life itself. Because these are what we call the essential amino acids in human biology because we can't make them. Why can't we make them? Because we don't have the shikimate pathway. So we depend on the bacteria in our gut or the bacteria in the soil and the plants that would live there to produce the essential amino acids. So you can't have serotonin or dopamine without the aromatic amino acids. And so fascinatingly, we now subtract that from the nutritional food chain, and now we birth children that have brains that seem to be overwhelmed by the simplest of inputs. They simply, in the womb, do not have the building blocks for the proteins that would become their neurotransmitter and signaling cascades within their brain or immune system. Fascinating that we have eliminated the building blocks for life with just the effort to pick less weeds. I wish it stopped there, but it turns out that disease happens through elimination of those protein structures. And without the protein structures, we develop dis-ease in all kinds of different systems. And fortunately, the plant world has all kinds of medicines for those diseases. And since Hippocrates, with the famous debut of Western medicine out of the Greek world there, said, "Let thy food be thy medicine." He, of course, stole that from the Chinese doctors who had, for 3,000 years previous to him, been saying, let thy food be thy medicine, but he always gets credit. It all comes down to good PR in the world. I mean, really, that's how history has been written. And so he had a good PR team. He got all this credit for recognizing that all of these medicines were in our food itself. And they're fascinating compounds, things like quinine, which kills malaria or checks the growth of malaria. And so if we took out the alkaloids, we would expect an overgrowth of the parasites because we don't have the natural antiparasitic checks within our food chain. And so we would see an emergence of more parasites. We would see a ton of asthma, which is, by the way, 1 in 4 children in Australia now with asthma. And that's because they universally screen for asthma intelligently. Somehow, in the US, we don't screen for asthma. I don't know how this is possible, but pediatricians are not trained to universally screen for asthma, and they wait for the parent or a teacher or somebody to point out that the kid's wheezing. And so it turns out that we would have an epidemic of asthma if we eliminated the ephedrine from our food chain itself. Anti-cancer compounds, if we removed the Homo Harrington family from our food, we'd see an epidemic of cancer. If we removed cholinomimetics, the galantamine being the best example, we would see a huge sensory processing deficit in the population. If we removed vincamine and the other vasodilators from the alkaloid families within the food, we'd see an enormous amount of hypertension and end-stage kidney disease. If we removed the quinidine, we'd see an enormous amount of atrial fibrillation and weird conduction problems with the heart. If we removed the morphine compounds that are present through the alkaloid pathways in food, we'd see an epidemic of chronic pain. If we removed the anti-hyperglycemic activity of piperine, we'd see an epidemic of diabetes in our population. And it turns out those are all made through the enzyme pathways that glyphosate blocks. Brilliantly interesting chemical here. And no doubt interesting that this company, Monsanto, that would produce such a chemical that we would then learn to spray on our food itself because we genetically modified the food so that it could be Roundup ready, we are now feeding our children and our adults a food straight that's missing our essential amino acids. We can't make serotonin, dopamine, and the rest. We can't treat the diseases that would come out of this defective food chain. And we end up with a huge glut of chronic disease that is then treated at a rate of $3 trillion a year. $3 trillion we currently spend on our health care, which of course is not care or health. But we spend $3 trillion to treat these diseases, and it's the pharmaceutical industry, Pharmaca first and now Bayer, that owns Monsanto. And so it's not a conspiracy theory, it's just damn good business. If we created a food chain that was missing the medicine of the food, we would have to sell that medicine back to them on the back side of that experience. And as a former chemotherapy developer, I was involved in this crap. And so one of the chemicals I worked with all the time was a chemotherapeutic agent called vincristine. Vincristine is a completely normal product of green food, especially algae, really good at making it. And so it turns out that as we've added glyphosate, vincristine disappears in the food chain and from our water systems that would end up in our fish. And so we wipe out vincristine, and so now we make it in our pharmaceutical labs by growing algae in environments where there's no Roundup. And so we grow algae in these massive things, and it makes vincristine, and we pull that out of the fluid system, and we sell that back to the population at $28,000 a gram. It's a naturally occurring compound, which the pharmaceutical industry doesn't want you to know, because we think of pharmaceuticals as these man-made chemicals, and the FDA tries to hold this mystique. Vincristine is a normally occurring molecule that should be readily available throughout our nutrient environment that would check the growth of any cancer cells. And yet, we sell it for $28,000 a gram. Compare that to the cost of gold. So much more radically expensive than these things that we consider things, and we're selling this back to you. All right, trends in glyphosate spraying. We're now spraying over 2 billion kilograms worldwide, which is around 4.5 billion pounds of this chemical into our systems. And unfortunately, it's a water-soluble toxin, which is a very bad idea. The word toxin and water should not go together on a planet that's 70% water, that grows vegetables that are 70% water, that grows humans that are 70% water. And so when you add a water-soluble toxin to a water planet, it turns out it gets everywhere. And so this is what we're dealing with. And so let's look back at our cancer maps, and let's take a look from 1992 to 2011 and the spraying patterns across the country as we debuted in 1992 the technique of spraying wheat in our northern climates. Wheat was never sprayed with Roundup until 1992. And suddenly the emergence within 6 years of what we call gluten sensitivity and celiac disease. And ever since 1992, there's been a 30 to 50% increase in the number of acres worldwide sprayed with Roundup on the wheat. So the bread becomes a delivery system for not gluten, but actually glyphosate with the gluten. And our group has demonstrated that you don't get gluten sensitivity at the intestinal lining until it sees glyphosate, at which point it expresses the receptor for gliadin, which is the breakdown product of the gluten, and you get leaky gut from the bread that's been in our food chain for thousands of years. In addition, the wheat is sprayed to kill it early and faster, which means that the proteins and fibers in that gluten are not mature and never were able to dry in the field normally. And so we end up with the wrong carbohydrates, the wrong fibers, and the wrong macroproteins in that wheat, and we consume that with the glyphosate, which destroys our barrier system, and we end up with the toxin. So you start spraying there. Now by 2011, you can see just how much we're spraying. Now realize that there's a very poor correlation in the end of this density of cancer with this map, because we should see all of the spraying down here if I was right. And that was just depressing when I found that, because I thought I had found the smoking gun. And then some months later, I found this map. And this is actually from the U.S. Geologic Center. And this is a projection of all of the tributaries of the Mississippi River. And if you overlay all the tributaries of the Mississippi with this density of spraying, you realize we're picking up 85–90% of all the glyphosate sprayed in our country into one water system and delivering it down one river, which ends in this tornado-looking structure. And the last 90 miles of that from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, Louisiana, is now called Cancer Alley, the highest cancer rates in the whole world. And so you are an organic garden. And our journey from right now to this evening will be to figure out what can we do to reinforce your natural garden. What can we do to bring you back in line with a nature that is here for your life? At the cellular level, it's here to nurture you, to bless you, to bring you to your full potential. You guys are all finding pathways towards this, else you wouldn't be here today looking as healthy as you do. But we hope we reinforce your sense of connection with nature, the love of that nature for you, your purpose within that nature, and together as a community, we will enrichen one another in the wisdom that would come out of that. Thank you for your attention this morning. Look forward to the rest of the day.